Good afternoon. My name is John Moulton. I'm with the Council on Strategic Risks. And this afternoon, I'm grateful for all those who were able to take time to attend and shift from doing this on the Hill to a virtual environment. So I appreciate your flexibility on that, but especially for having our panelists with us today, Admiral Bernard, Dr. Venkayya, and Dr. Lattimore. And it's really to help staffers on the Hill gain an understanding as we look at the reauthorization of the Pandemic and All Hazards Prevention Act, which expires this September, in terms of what that unique role of the White House is in preparing for a pandemic, and then also if we had to actually go through and execute to take some of the experiences that they had going across 4 administrations to when the bio position started in the White House, and then through Ebola, and then up into the recent COVID pandemic, to gain some of the understanding of what we can do and what can be done in a PAPA Reauthorization Act, to gain a better understanding of what is the role of the White House in terms of setting policy, in terms of holding departments and agencies accountable, ensuring the funding is right, and then working with Congress in all these different areas. So I'm grateful today to have everyone's participation. And really what I'd like to do after we do some introductions, I'll ask a few questions, but my preference is to open it up to audience participation. So please go ahead and use the Q&A function below on the bottom of your screen and go ahead and start asking questions, because this is really up for you. And we want to make certain it's beneficial and you can learn from the experience of these leaders as you go about crafting the language for a PAPA reauthorization this summer and hopefully passage later this fall. So without that, I will turn it over to Admiral Bernard for some opening remarks, and then to Dr. Lattimore and Dr. Venkayya after that. Admiral?
Hi, you hear me okay? Great. Back in 1998, health and security were not linked at all. And I think people forget how quickly we've raised the health security agenda to the level of a national security issue. In 98, Secretary Donna Shalala sent me over to the White House kind of on a lark to open an office of health and security at the NSC. And it was me and the secretary. And for the first 3 weeks, my offices were actually on the stairs of the old executive office building because they didn't have an office for me. It's an interesting change between 1998 and today. And literally, the public health community has in the past pushed back hard against health being a national security issue. There are 2 reasons for that. One is the health people thought that it was not a humanitarian approach. It was much more of a conflict-oriented approach. And the second was that the national security community just didn't want to do public health. They still don't want to do public health, but they're in under current circumstances, they don't have a whole lot of choice since it is a national security issue. I worked at the White House through 2 administrations, through the Clinton administration, through the first term of the Bush administration. And doing health and security, and it changed. Remember, health and security used to be only the US response to potential biologic threats like bio attacks from Russia or whoever, terrorists especially. And that was because of the anthrax attacks after 9/11, as you remember. Over the years, and Rajeev can talk about this to a greater extent, it became more and more a both natural and intentional epidemic risk to our national security. And most recently, of course, with COVID, it was clearly a natural event that actually caused the shutdown of countries all over the world and millions of deaths. So, but don't forget that all of the original laws that were passed, the original PAPA appropriation, the original laws that were passed after 9/11 were not designed to support an emergency from a naturally caused disease, but in fact were designed to deal with procurement of countermeasures and distribution of countermeasures if we were attacked with a biologic weapon. This transition has caused some difficulty both in the legislation and in the implementation of policies. And you'll see that, and if you keep that in mind when you're doing this, you'll understand when things don't seem to make sense. I mean, why didn't they do this? Why didn't the stockpile include hundreds of millions of masks and gowns? Well, in a biologic attack, that wouldn't have been your highest priority. It would have been smallpox vaccine or anthrax vaccine, et cetera. So be aware of that when you're doing this, that oddities in the law that you're building upon were based on the intent of those original laws, not on how they've evolved over the last 20 years. You have to also remember that the White House Office of Biosecurity or Biodefense, or whatever they call it at any point in time, it changes, is actually a policy office. They don't have money for programs. They're supposed to set an interagency process among all the government agencies, et cetera, for a whole of government response from a policy point of view. It's actually the agencies and the departments that have the money and the mandate to spend it, which is why your legislation with regards to the PAPA bill, as well as other legislation you do, is so important. Remember, the White House can't spend money because if they do, they have to testify to Congress on how they spent it. And in order to advise the president, you can't conflate the two. The president has to be able to have people that can talk to him or her without a knowing that they're going to be also required to testify to Congress on what they said. So the agencies that you are funding, it really matters that they have the both the money and the authorities to actually accomplish what the policy says. One last thing before I pass it on here, and that is there's a big problem with who's in charge of policy for health in the United States. If you sit around with a group of people, I don't care where you are, even I teach at Stanford sometimes, and I'll sit around with a bunch of the really senior foreign policy people there and say, who's in charge of setting policy for international or public health or pandemics? Not a single person can give me a name. They talk about, well, isn't it CDC? Isn't there someone at the White House? I'm not sure, whatever. This needs to be clarified, and we need to know who is in charge for public health planning, preparedness, and then emergency operations, at least from a policy point of view. I've written on this extensively, actually, and my approach to it is to have the equivalent of a combatant commander in the White House. That is somebody who is like Ashish Jha, for example, was for COVID, but for the whole pandemic and international public health, national security field. That person should be identified, should be senior, and should have the authority to make policy. And when you are writing legislation for the agencies, I would hope you would keep in mind that they're the ones that have to implement that policy. And I think that's why the reauthorization of PAPA is so important, especially in this post-pandemic time when people are trying to forget about COVID. We can't afford to forget about COVID. The next one could be worse. So let me pass it on to John.
Great, thank you. Dr. Lattimore?
Thank you. Let me just start with a little bit of background so that I can fully disclose all the bias in my talking points. I am currently a senior director at Ginkgo Bioworks, which is a cell engineering company, and we also have a biosecurity arm where we are focused on surveillance of pathogens. I've been with Ginkgo for about 10 months now. Prior to that, I spent about 20 years with the government. and I would draw your attention to, from my background, the diversity of positions I've held, often in more recent years, writing strategy, coordinating interagency, executing at the interagency level, but also down to as just a performer and a program manager within the Department of Defense, and having to execute on other strategies and legislation. And so I have a strong bias towards, okay, great idea. How are we going to execute on that? And where's it going to work and where's it going to fall apart? And let's try to talk about that on the front end so we can smooth out those rough spots and make it all work. So I was most recently a Department of the Army civilian, was the director of traumatic brain injury for the Army, and detailed into the White House for 3 years. So I spent 18 months in the Trump administration and 18 months in the Biden administration, both in the Office of Science and Technology Policy, where I was the executive director of the National Science and Technology Council, so coordinating interagency science and R&D, and then over to OMB, where I worked in the National Security Division in the Veterans and Defense Health Branch. In the middle of that, I also was detailed into the National Response Coordination Center, which was FEMA and ASPR coming together under the Stafford Act, and had kind of other duties as assigned, as we would say in the military, but one of those was to stand up the data task force. And so strong bias across that implementation, in particular at the interagency level. And building on some of the previous comments, I would say it is really important from my perspective to understand how the Executive Office of the President coordinates policy and where that works and where that doesn't work. As we say in the military, it's very much an above the line function. So you write the policy and you oversee it. You don't have the ability to do. And in order to execute that policy, then we're pushing it out to the executive agencies. And so if we have a strategy or if we have a coordinated effort, we don't necessarily have the ability to coordinate at the agency level what we're doing. So you might get 3 different parts of the federal government executing the same exact thing, and then other elements of the strategy or the effort are being left open. So then the question becomes, how do we implement at the interagency level to try to decrease those gaps and make sure we don't have redundancies, thereby making the dollars go further so we can do more capable things. There's a number of policy mechanisms I'd be happy to talk to you about that I've seen work. There's some I've seen not work, but one that I would put a pin in for this group is the National Response Coordination Center. So what was stood up under the Stafford Act, and the quick version of how and why that worked from my perspective as a person within it was because there's 2 major things that slow down interagency coordination, assuming the political leaders are aligned on which way we're going. One is the funding, and everything has to go up to Office of Management and Budget, to OMB, to move things around and work with the Hill to make sure we're working within the appropriations and the authorization. And the other is legal agreements. We have to be able to trade information. Information is the most important commodity in these responses. And we have all kinds of challenges with data use agreements or just general discussion as we try to coordinate. And so that mechanism had General Counsel and OMB right at the table with senior leaders, helping to smooth that out on the front end so that when the Department of Defense or HHS was given a task based on their ability, they were able to go out much more smoothly. There are some other policy mechanisms, but we can come back to it. Pivoting to 2 other points that I'd like to flag before I turn off my mic. One is, from my perspective, it is incredibly important to ensure that we're building a system that is connecting the surveillance on the front end of a response to medical countermeasures. So right now, those tasks are somewhat divided, and there is a challenge for information flow. In the response, the way we approach this was much in the way that the intelligence community approaches everything overseas. And it's what information can we collect, both open source information, private information where we can get it, or US government information, overlay that to triangulate new insights to then drive action. So that might be a policy mechanism. We saw a pathogen pop up, and we need to communicate to those communities that something's amiss, and we need to figure that out. It can also be, though, identifying new pathogens and trying to put that into the medical countermeasure pipeline. So with my own experience right now at Ginkgo, when we were working on, we still do have a program with the CDC where we're collecting at airports. So inbound passengers are volunteering to give samples, and we are also collecting from aircraft wastewater. In some of those cases, our teams were able to identify COVID variants of concern, so those that are going to be immune evasive, up to 43 days before patients showed up to a hospital in mass for the medical community to realize there's a signal and that's an issue. But we as a company don't have a means to communicate that information over to BARDA or other elements of the US government who could give that to industry to say, hey, let's make a monoclonal antibody right now for this, add 43 days to that timeline, and then be able to plug that back in. So I offer that example as just one way we should be thinking about baseline surveillance data and then escalating that, layering that. So when we see something that's amiss, we then can act with additional surveillance or take immediate policy action or plug that into the medical countermeasure pipeline. When we do that, we're going to make the whole response a lot smoother. And that is going to have to be a government role of sorts. And it's something that I think could be addressed as you get to the relationships between the White House and the agencies. And then the third part would just be to say, we need to have an ongoing R&D pipeline collectively that's constantly filling all the technology readiness levels of each part of the response. So that is surveillance, that is analysis, that's production of that intelligence and communication of that intelligence broadly into the medical countermeasures pipeline, which could be any variety of pharmaceutical or other capabilities. And when we start to do that with the mindset of how do we execute that in not just here, low and middle income countries, so resource deprived locations afar, or domestically where we have low resource, where we really struggled was in communities in IHS and other rural spaces where we didn't have the right capabilities to push the medical countermeasures out the door. So just thinking about that on the front end and allowing, and so then let me bring it back to this, wrapping it up. The people who are designing these solutions and then running through the exercises to figure out how to integrate them in real time, in practice, in advance of all of this, they need to have a communication line back to the White House. This cannot be done without White House engagement because you need that leadership. You need the benevolent dictator to say, this is what we're doing and this is how we're doing it. Normal interagency process for policy coordination and communication can be too slow. And so it would be worthwhile to talk about how whatever is built out in ASPR, other executive agencies, has the appropriate linkage to the White House office to communicate that up. And the flip side of that is the White House, as was previously said, the White House doesn't have the staffing or the budget nor the authorities to actually implement. So the staff can't sit there. And those staff that are supporting it probably need to be largely career civil servants, much more like OMB, where there's resident knowledge passed as we transition from administration to administration, or just in general, to complement what we typically see coming in through the political network, which is a lot of outside expertise. So there's got to be that complementary workforce. So with that, I probably ran over, but let me pause there and turn the mic over.
Thank you. Dr. Venkayya?
Thanks, John. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today, and really appreciate Ken and Tracie's opening remarks. I'll try to build upon them. Also, to provide full disclosure, I'm the CEO of a biotech that is developing antiviral therapies called Aerium Therapeutics, but I also sit on the board of CEPI, which is the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, a global government-funded multilateral organization. I shouldn't call it multilateral, multi-government funded organization that is developing vaccines for epidemic and pandemic threats. I guess my reason for being here is because I succeeded Ken in his role as the first head of Biodefense in the White House, and Ken really created an incredible foundation within the Executive Office of the President and an appreciation for biothreats that made it possible to do a lot of things that extended to naturally occurring threats. And I guess I'll open with my piece of this with a vignette on how I think the White House can play a role in both preparedness and response without taking away from the critical lead role that departments and agencies play in both preparedness and response. So as some of you may recall, in the early 2000s, following the anthrax attacks, we had naturally occurring threats that also came to the government's attention, including SARS, the first SARS, and H5N1 avian influenza that began in Asia. But given the history of pandemics and the recognition that most human pandemics originated in animals, there was an increasing concern that H5N1 could become the cause of the next global pandemic. And in fact, this caught the attention of President Bush, who requested that a strategy to address pandemic flu be developed. Now, this is a critical insight that I want to share. There had been a history of pandemic plans being developed by the Department of Health and Human Services, and those were good plans to address the health and medical issues related to pandemics. The difference between that and what the president directed was that he wanted a strategy for the nation that covered all sectors, because he recognized, in reflecting on what happened in the 1918 pandemic, that this virus, the next pandemic virus, would touch every sector of society, touch everybody in a community. And the reality is that no single department, including HHS, could properly or fully anticipate and address all of the issues that would be created by a pandemic virus. Of course, to all of us today, this is obvious because we've lived through over 3 years of a pandemic. But in the mid-2000s, that was a very new concept for people, that you could have a biological threat that could disrupt lives and livelihoods in the economy, the way that we've seen with COVID-19. So the president was pressing, I would say, in asking that the White House play a key role in developing the strategy as well as an implementation plan. And that implementation plan, planning process proved to be instrumental in bringing the government together and putting departments and agencies on the same page with regard to planning assumptions, critical capabilities, and how to coordinate a response. This would have been very difficult to do if there was a single department like HHS or DHS trying to bring together others and instruct them on what their role would be during a pandemic. I would say that at the conclusion of this pandemic planning effort, we had a well-oiled machine, as to the extent that you can have that across departments and agencies, with senior level individuals just below the assistant secretary at 14 different departments and agencies that were getting together on a sometimes weekly basis to work on pandemic planning. That's an extraordinary concept if you think about it before COVID-19 happened. This is in the mid-2000s. And when the Bush administration ended, there was, I think, a very good infrastructure and set of relationships in place, as well as an understanding at all departments and agencies as to what their role would be during an outbreak or, let's say, a pandemic. That is a capability that would serve the nation very well if it were preserved and maintained. That, I think, largely went away over the ensuing years for a variety of reasons. But had we had that at the beginning of COVID-19, I think it would have made a significant difference in how we approached the early days of the pandemic and the overall response. So this is to highlight the role that the White House can play in bringing departments and agencies together to support an overarching preparedness effort. I think that the White House role extends to response. This is not response in the sense of managing an operations center and having conference calls 3 times a day to see how we're doing in the response. This is really a way of monitoring what the government is doing, directing departments and agencies to address areas of the response that need to be strengthened, essentially holding all of government accountable. But at the same time, ensuring that obstacles are removed from departments and agencies so that they can be more effective in a way that only the White House can accomplish. This is a concept in crisis response that isn't, I think, widely appreciated, that if you have the executive office of the president involved to be able to remove roadblocks. It can make it a lot easier for departments and agencies to do their job. And where there are breakdowns in collaboration or coordination, then the EOP can step in and help there as well. So I'll pause there just to provide that example, and then maybe we can talk a little bit more about the separation of responsibilities between the White House and departments and agencies more explicitly. Back to you, John.
Great, thank you, Dr. Venkayya. I think that's a lot to think about as we look at the extent of the challenge that we saw in COVID, and how some of you referred to the fact that, you know, it could have been much worse, but you look at the terms of lives, military readiness, economics. I think it only makes sense that we look at now and think, okay, what are the things we can do now so we're better organized to coordinate something like this in the future? And Admiral Bernard, I'd like to go back to your point. When you were talking, you were saying, you're referring to like a combatant commander, which of course for me as a retired naval officer, that means a certain thing. And the way I look at it is, in an oversimplification, the role of a combatant commander is basically resources and authorities. Okay, that they're not the person that's storming the hill or doing things, but they're deciding, they get the task that says, you know, we need you to do this, you have this responsibility, but they figure out, do I need a joint task force? Can service components do it? I want you to do this, I want you to do that. And they're the ones basically making certain that things are happening. And then as Dr. Venkayya said, like, they're able to throw those blocks. They're able to be like, okay, wait a minute, this is a problem here. We need to free this up. So I'm wanting to transition that, because the White House, combatant commander wouldn't have a secretary, it would be a little bit different. I'm wondering if you could expand on that a little bit about how you would see that position or that function happening, or what would that person need to succeed in a combatant commander-like role at the White House level. And also I'll throw out, this is an opportunity for folks to start asking questions on question and answer. So thank you.
Back in the 80s, that's 1980s, Goldwater and Nichols did a reorganization of the Defense Department. And many of the services were furious that they created a joint staff and a chairman of the joint staff. And in order to solve the problem of lack of coordinated communication and action between the services, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, they had their own vertical structures, much like the departments in the US government and agencies do. I mean, somebody at NIH does not answer to the director of CDC, right? So, and I think it was a good model, and it's worth looking that up as a way to reorganize the oversight of the issues where you don't want to recreate the individual agencies. You don't want to take away that which NIH does well and conflate it with that which CDC does well, or conflate it with that which DoD does. Every agency needs to do what it does. They just need to do it better together without overlapping. And as Rajeev just said, when there's a conflict between the two, it needs to be able to be cleared up quickly, efficiently, and without question, right? That's the combatant commander's role. And while they wouldn't call it a combatant commander at the White House because they don't like to look like a military command there, the principles are the same. In fact, defense is even more difficult than the US government as a whole, as you know, for those of you who have been in the service. So I think they just need a person, an office with a director at a very senior level. And that senior level needs to be like a combatant commander. They can pick up the telephone and they can call the Secretary of Defense, and the Secretary of Defense will answer the phone. They need that at the White House. I think it should be a deputy assistant to the president. I think it should be at the National Security Council, although it seems like it's been decided to put this person somewhere else in the executive office of the president. But people listen when the NSC calls. As Rajeev will say, if you pick up the phone and you call anybody and you say you're a special assistant to the president at the White House, you will not get put on hold, except long enough for them to pick up the phone. And that's what we really need. And we need a commander at the White House that deals across all of the issues, including natural, accidental, and deliberate biologic events. They're obviously national security issues. And like I said, 20 years ago, both sides of the discussion, the public health side and the national security side, did not want them. They had their own reasons for not making them a unified issue. And I think we need a combatant commander, whatever you might call them. I think deputy assistant to the president would be appropriate. However, at the White House, to do exactly what Tracie and Rajeev have been talking about, to actually be the person who can deconflate conflicts and make things happen.
John, can I just add to that? I think that you're never going to have a big staff to do work at the White House, nor should you, in my view. I think Ken would probably, Trace would probably agree. But you do need to have real expertise to be able to call things as you see them. And where agencies are not adequately attending to, say, a technical issue, which has happened, you need to be able to call that out. And so senior staff in the White House and the president, I think, benefit from having another point of view on particularly biological events. Have seen many instances where the responsible agencies, departments had a certain view on an issue that reflected deep experience and expertise, but didn't necessarily have the orthogonal perspective on it that you can get if you're not in the middle of it. And so I think having a small staff of people that are with the appropriate experience is really, really important for this office.
No, I think that's very valid. In my last job before I retired was on the joint staff working regional issues, and there was one regional issue, and we would meet interagency weekly with the White House, and you soon learned that you missed that meeting at your own peril, because you understood what the perspective was, some upcoming events that you might otherwise not be tracking from what your day job was in your service or department, and it was really good to have different representation at that meeting. Of course, the White House kicked it off, but it also helped you understand who else was working that problem set or that issue. So you could talk to other people in other departments, or you had an idea, or you could float things there. And for me, that was very helpful on that problem set. I want to go back, Admiral Bernard, to what you had mentioned on the COCOM. Is this something that you see existing every day when we're not currently in the midst of a pandemic, or is it one of those that we should have like underneath the national response framework or a plan that says, you know, if this is happening, then we would introduce this person? I'm curious your thoughts on that.
Well, it's a good question. The big problem with COVID, and you recall the same thing happened with Ebola, when they suddenly had to create a czar at the White House. Ron Klain, the later became chief of staff, was the Ebola czar. And then you had Ashish Jha and others that were the COVID czars. That's a terrible, terrible, terrible way to do things, because they have to get up to speed. They're the right people, but they should be in the job before the pandemic or before the emergency happens, so that they can make sure that the process to deal with the operational process of response has been exercised, and the people all know each other. You mentioned the having the weekly meetings that the joint staff did for your project or your regional issue. It's the same thing. There should be, you know, a bi-week, maybe once every 2 weeks or 3 weeks or whatever. You get together with all the people that will be the point people should the shoe drop on a pandemic, and they know what their responsibilities are going to be because you're talking about, they know they can call each other. And when their assistant says, we have, General Jones on the line, you know exactly who it is. You say, hi, John. You don't say, hi, General Jones. You really need to know these people. And that would cut the response time and the problems in immeasurably. Back in the Clinton administration, Congress demanded that they create an Office of the Weapons of Mass Destruction at the NSC or at the White House, just like they did with this new pandemic office that Congress has created for the White House. And so what the White House did back then, which I think was exactly the right thing to do, my opinion, is they took the senior director, special assistant to the president for counterproliferation, who dealt with all of those issues anyway, and just dual-hatted them and said, you are now the director of the Office of Weapons of Mass Destruction. And that way he could, it was Gary Seymour, if I recall, who satisfied the need of Congress to have somebody assigned to the task, but didn't create a new institution, a new administrative institution with 20 or 30 people and budget requirements and all of these issues. If you do that, and what seems to be happening now is with this new pandemic office, if you do that, it's going to take 2 years to staff it up and to get it funded. And what are we going to do for those 2 years? Who's going to do the job? We don't need another czar. We need somebody whose job it is from day one to do the job. And they have to be doing it between pandemics, not during the pandemic only.
John, if I could, I just wanted to add a couple attributes to make it more specific that I think are necessary. It's certainly been described, you have to have access to the power, and the White House does that for you. But you also have to have appropriate political and policy EQ. You have to be able to scrub in technically to a real variety of issues. You have to have friends across the government and across industry. I think if we were all to talk about the crises we've managed ourselves, it's always been through your friends and your networks and that collateral information. That's how it's really getting done. And I think the people who I saw do the best were people who had worked in interagency assignments, had worked with another department or agency, whether domestically or in embassies. And maybe that maps back to some of the connection points, but it's certainly as a DoD person working with the State Department, those are two very different cultures. And it's important to understand what's behind that and how they're coming at things. That was my experience coming from DoD to HHS as well. And so whatever mechanisms there are to create some level of rotation, the way they do across the Department of Defense, where you have to have joint assignments to make rank. And then also just very experienced under pressure. It is hard to make decisions. It's hard to sit in those rooms when there's a lot on the line and make the calculus about when do you step in. And I think you only get that from experience. And so I think I would push on some of the various staff who have been selected in different ways. The ones who I saw be most successful had grown up in different kinds of roles that gave them the opportunity to have to experience that pressure cooker at a lower level. And I would say that also is at the agency level too. We saw that, why did the move to FEMA impact things so much? It was because FEMA was used to that crisis response. The HHS culture, they just hadn't been through those motions before. So it was new to them. That was a hard first run. but what can we do to build a structure where there is rotation through that kind of exercise or through groups where you could get that real life experience? I think those dynamics are really important. And that also is going to map to, again, this blend between the White House part of this and the connection to the agencies. And I would say when I was in NSTC, I certainly had to be, scrubbing in on a lot of really diverse topics and be able to do that. But I also had 900 subject matter experts across the federal government that I could phone at any point who were writing documents and say, hey, I need you to help me understand this. And, it's the same kind of forum where you have access through the agencies. You can bulk up there if you have the appropriate connection points and hand off for the information.
Yeah, I appreciate that. One of the things that I was taught in my time doing crisis response in the Navy was that, first responders should never meet for the first time during a national crisis, so I think it bears that out because you have that relationship. So even if hopefully you don't have the same workload or focus, because there's not a, oh my goodness, national level crisis going on, it does make sense to have that expertise, that reach back, a better understanding of who does what. So if called upon, you already understand how it works, who to talk to, so you can get things done. Dr. Lattimore, I wanted to follow up in the beginning or opening remarks. You had talked about two barriers that can come up. So you said you want to have, an OMB rep in there because money, resources is an important thing if you actually want to do things. And you mentioned legal. Can you do things? Is there a prohibition against it? What's the way to make that happen? I was wondering if you could, expand upon where that happens, because if you don't have a large standing organization, you're not going to have that expertise in there. Is that something that gets pulled up? Is that something that you have more of a liaison function? How does that happen? And then the third thing I'll throw at you is, from my own experience, is at your own risk, if you didn't include a public affairs person or a communicator, it was not helpful, because eventually when you're looking at a national level response where so much happens locally, so much has to be communicated, that if you're not thinking about that, and I'm just looking at about executing, I'm not even thinking about adversary countries doing information operations and trying to rip it apart, which is also ever present these days. If you just comment on the role maybe of thinking about that ahead of time also.
Sure, happy to. I mean, I think, well, and Christine's on, and she could probably speak to some of this with even more detail from personal experience in OWS. But where we had efficiencies in the operation, it was because we were able to cut red tape. And the red tape is sometimes really important, but I should say, I don't want to say it. The regulation, the oversight, all of those processes are incredibly important. The red tape is the part we get frustrated about, like the lost time in between. So a different example is, I was working at interagency data agreement on veteran suicide. We couldn't spend the money in the time allotted because we couldn't get it through all the different legal hurdles across Department of Energy and VA and some of the others. That's the kind of thing that disappeared in the NRCC, with the legal team saying, here's what's going out, and pushing that out through legal channels on down. I think OMB was in a similar place within the EOP for all interagency process. OMB is at just about they're at every meeting for interagency. I don't know that their expertise is always asked of, right? Like, they sit there and are often in receive mode, as opposed, and some examiners are more vocal and more engaged, and they're the ones who are helping, I think, much more so solve, like, hey, I know that's a great idea. Here's what I think you're trying to do. The reason I don't think it will work this way is because there's this mechanism, there's this restriction, but you could use these funds, or we could go about it in this way and you can get it done. That kind of engagement and partnership with the examiner is what you need. That really has to be a political lead, right? So the executive office is not different than the other agencies, where as a career person, you are beholden to the political staff. That is an important relationship. And it is generally honored very well. If the political staff at OMB or in any of these other locations gives direction, the teams will move out. And so I would say one of the things that I saw as an advantage was that OMB had a senior political member sitting in a lot of these discussions at the NRCC and bridging into the White House. I would say the disadvantage, being very candid, is that that person didn't always have the actual expertise necessary to answer those technical questions we were just talking about. But there is some ability to do that. And I think that's probably legal is a little bit more translatable across lawyers maybe than the OMB stuff, which is complicated. And then to your third point, Absolutely. The coordination has to be on all levels. I do think that the command structure of the NSC always rules, because it's experienced government staff who know how to coordinate within the agencies, departments, and interagency. I think that's what we saw at FEMA, where they're very comfortable commanding other groups, and also reassuring career government staff that, like, hey, I know you don't have this authority, and this sounds like you're violating the rule, but you're not. We have special authorities for emergency response. That coaching was something that FEMA was really good at to help bring detailed staff along. And there was certainly a comms component of that, which maybe was a little bit bungled for other reasons, but not because the structure wasn't there, just because of other reasons.
Could I comment on that? First off, I agree. Tracie got it exactly right. You need the authority. You also need, I never had a policy meeting where the OMB examiner and a lawyer weren't in the room. In fact, I would sometimes, if I couldn't get the right person, lawyer or OMB person in the room, I'd cancel or change the meeting and tell everybody I was doing it for that purpose. And that raised their status in the room too. When you tell a bunch of assistant secretaries, we can't have this meeting because the OMB person isn't going to be there, and policy without budget is shelfware. You know, it's like, there's no point in doing this if we can't get the budget for it. And that can really only happen at the White House, because OMB is a place unto itself, as Christine will probably explain. And I think that's exactly right. I think the interagency process, it must emanate from the White House, because what ends up happening otherwise is, they tried it with HHS during the Trump administration. They tried to move it out to HHS, and they gave Bob Kadlec the responsibility as the head of ASPR to do the interagency. Well, as good as Bob Kadlec is, he's probably the only person good enough to be able to actually pull that off. It didn't work because most of the other agencies knew that HHS has no authority to tell them to do anything, much less budget for anything. So it's just a non-starter. So nonetheless, I think again, I want to come back to the point that the people on this call are going to have to deal with. You can't just leave it to the White House to do this. Policy needs implementers, and the White House cannot be the operational arm of the US government. It does not work. Legally, it doesn't work. So you've got to fund, when you decide what you need to do, it has to go to an agency. There has to be an operational division somewhere that has allocated the money to actually make this happen. And that's why POP is so important here. It looks like people are not enthusiastic about spending money on public health preparedness at the moment. It's a problem. We're done with COVID. Everybody wants to move on to other things. We have lots of other issues. We have South China Sea issues. We have Ukraine issues. We have lots of issues out there. And preparing for a new pandemic is way down everybody's list. And that's why POP is important to get right, so that we can actually get the planning done in the background and be able to make sure that the next time we respond in a more rapid and efficient manner than we did for Ebola or COVID.
Before I jump to Dr. Venkayya, Christine, did you have anything you wanted to add from your previous experience at the OMB?
Can you hear me? Hi, everyone. Just for background purposes, I was an examiner at the Office of Management and Budget from 2010 to 2021, and was the BARDA examiner, working closely with Dr. Kadlec's team during the first part of the pandemic. And I guess what I would say is basically to emphasize, many of the points that have already been made, but to say that, when you think about the Executive Office of the President, we tend to talk about that kind of holistically, but there are different personalities and different cultures in each different component of the Executive Office of the President. And so while OMB definitely needs to be at the table, when all of these various policies are being discussed and implemented. I think the point about having political leadership directing OMB what to do, it can't be understated, can't be overstated. OMB as an organization is conservative and risk averse, definitely very concerned with what is legal, and that is very important. But I would say in terms of being a component of the EOP that enables operational sort of operational aspects of a response, you need that bureaucracy to be nimble. And when I say conservative and risk averse, I just mean that your typical OMB examiner and the whole civil servant structure there, you know, they want all the facts on the table, and they want to know all of the implications of every possible action you might be considering taking. And in these kinds of circumstances, those aren't possibilities. And so you need political leadership to encourage and push people to sort of be comfortable making decisions when there's uncertainty and lack of data. So I guess I would just leave it at that. But I think everything that's been said here has been well said. Thank you.
Christine, if I could just add to that, it is an interesting caveat that many of the OMB examiners were PMFs or came in at very early points in their career and didn't necessarily work in the agencies that they are working with. And certainly you were an exception when you rotated in, having been in industry for a while and worked in those spaces you were overseeing. When I rotated in, I was one of the very few people on my team who had served in the military and interfaced with the VA largely. And from within, I was able to push in a lot of the same ways Christine is describing, which is, hey, that's not how that works, or, just running things down through connections, and then elevate that up to our SCS leadership and political leadership to kind of get the pressure back down. And I do think that those nuances are really important parts of this. The flip side of that is the OMB examiner life is kind of chaotic and intense, particularly in certain timeframes. And there's things that other parts of the EOP and the agencies could do to make their life a little bit easier, even just understanding what's needed to make those decisions. Because I don't see OMB frequently leading the charge, but they certainly can block your charge. And that's the risk. And so that is partially why they're always there, because they'll block you if they don't understand it. And how do we collectively as a government think about getting them spun up with the information they need so they're also not reading it for the first time in real time?
Good points.
Yeah, thank you both for sharing that. Dr. Venkayya, if I could go back to a point you made earlier, that the White House is not an operations center. It's not, they're not the ones staffed or organized to do that. But you did talk about that they need to respond when they see problem areas, when they see things not happening. Basically, one, to hold accountable, but then also to remove those obstacles. I was wondering if you could share kind of your perspective or your thoughts on, is that something that should be legislated? As Admiral Bernard talked about Goldwater Nichols back in the late 80s. Or is that more something that it would be better if it came about through the political will of the administration? Is there pros and cons? Do you need both? I'm curious your perspective from having seen it your time in the office, and then when you saw it during, as it occurred during COVID.
Well, I think that there has been a step in this direction with the Prevent Act and the creation of this office, although not one that's really comes with funding. So this is a challenge. But in terms of the scope of the authority of that office and its director, by the way, I agree with Ken that ideally you'd have a deputy assistant to the president leading this office. Ideally, this would sit in the NSC. I think that is that's probably as far as Congress needs to go in terms of defining how the White House organizes itself, and then it's up to the president and their staff to figure out how to fully exploit the potential of that office. And giving that office expansive authority over deliberate and naturally occurring biological threats is a huge step forward, because we've seen that there's been fluctuating levels of attention and prioritization of these issues. There's been fluidity in where and how this is addressed. I mean, this is not the case for issues at the NSC. I mean, in the NSC, you go back decades and you've got, similar offices and structures that are dealing with, certain regional issues, for example, regional economic issues, for example. We should have that for biological threats. It's really not a political matter to be re-litigated every time an administration comes in. We should just agree that this has to be there. And then I think leveraging this office for both preparedness and so policy and preparedness and response is important. This gets to the practicing of the concept. So having the emergency czar installed, I completely agree, is not the right way to do this. You want to have somebody who knows the actors, understands the policy and preparedness landscape, and then they can help to ensure that the response is on track, whether it be small scale or large scale. And when I was in the role, we had pretty regular BioWatch hits where a threat agent was detected somewhere, and this is in the early days of BioWatch, didn't quite know how the government was going to work. And I think the EOP played an important role in ensuring awareness across the relevant departments and agencies, helping to kind of practice this response and work out some of the kinks. And that's a pretty small event, although it could have potentially big implications. So practicing with events like that so that you're ready for the bigger event, more ready for the bigger event when it happens, I think is really important.
Great, thank you for sharing that. Now I would, at this point, and for our audience members, I'd encourage, if I was the one that had to help craft PAPA reauthorization language and get it in front of my elected official boss, I would hopefully take advantage of this opportunity. So please, I'll throw that out there as your opportunity to weigh in, to use the question and answer function. And please let us know if there's any questions that you have that you would like to see addressed.
John, while you're waiting
Yeah.
on questions to come in, I would love to just build a little bit on that last point. Again, I said my bias is towards implementation and the challenges of implementation. Information is the most important commodity. It's what you have sitting on the hill. It's what we had in the EOP, where just tons of information is coming through you. And you have insights that other people don't have because you're seeing so much parallel information coming in. We currently don't have a system that's set up to really enable that and enable that sharing. And I think this is really relevant across the pipeline, the R&D pipeline, the surveillance to production pipeline, the development of medical countermeasures. So I wanted to reiterate that point, but it all starts with incoming data. And one of the things we talked about early in the response was whether we could leverage a common set of data points from the states in order to allocate from the SNS. So everybody needs stuff from the SNS. You want that? Sure, you can have it if you're providing the data we need to make those decisions. And we're making it based on what's in the US government system. So write your stuff so that it comes in here, and then you will automatically be in the queue. And I would say that concept is one that I would push everyone to explore, because as certainly as I've made the rounds on the Hill of late with everyone on the industry side, there's a lot of asks for funding. And I would push, if I were in my government hat, I would push back and say, okay, so what are you doing with the funding we gave you to make it more efficient? And I would be asking about how they're contributing data back in, and how production timelines, right? If you're producing a vaccine for the SNS, how long did it take you to produce that vaccine? What's your timeline? What operations do you have in place to shorten that timeline? There's a current, smallpox vaccine that's on a 11 to 12 month production cycle and can't sell internationally where there's a demand signal because they can't produce quickly enough. And there's complications around business dynamics of whether a company invests in that or not, but that is something where the government could invest in existing products and existing capabilities with some sections of funding to make that more efficient. In the same way they could invest in, instead of having each infectious disease, which has its own program across the agencies, put out their own funding. What are the core points where we need to collect surveillance data? And can we collect across these different pathogens and have that go into one common operating picture with the data? So those are the kinds of questions that I think are really relevant for fiscal responsibility, where a lot more could be done with the existing funding, just through various efficiencies in all of those different things: data, medical countermeasure production, information flow. And you're gonna have to be creative and then really get with the executive agencies and industry to understand where those gaps are.
And there's also an issue related to what has been said earlier about the normal interagency process being so slow. If the operational agencies like ASPR can bypass some of the red tape, it makes things a lot easier. Remember, if you're in the military, what you want to do is somehow link up with Special Operations Command, because Special Operations Command has all kinds of ways to get around the red tape. I mean, if they need something by tomorrow morning, they get it by tomorrow morning. You try to do that in the regular Army sometime. Not possible. Same thing with warp speed. Look how fast and well warp speed worked, thanks to Bob Kavlik and several others. But it involved breaking all the normal rules. And that's why we got the vaccine out in such a short period of time. It was, give me a good reason to do it, and then get it done. And let's cut the baloney in between. And the reason that worked is because the executive branch said, do it. And it, at a high enough level that you could not say no. The chairman of the Joint Staff or the Secretary of Defense says to do something, the rules get broken. Somebody goes and briefs Congress and tells Congress what we're trying to do, and obviously they can stop it if it's really egregious. But the fact is, we need to cut the red tape to deal with some of this stuff. And modeling a little bit on how Special Operations Command does that is not a bad idea. It worked for warp speed. It could work again.
Yeah, if I could jump in on that, having worked in the Special Operations community, one of the interesting things that they noticed, and General McChrystal talks about this in his Team of Team books, was they were not keeping on top of the information cycle in 2004, 2005 timeframe. And they were just like, this is not working. And so one of the things they did was they sent out liaison elements all over the place. So now what happened was, interestingly enough, you had more, I don't really like to use the term buy-in, but you had different parts of the government that understood how they could contribute to a national priority, whereas they might not have had that in the past. Or I think, Admiral, you were alluding to, like it gets buried, you know, like it's at this top level, but how does it funnel down? And the Special Operations community did a very good job, in my opinion, of ensuring that, of opening up who is in on those conversations, but also understanding like who could contribute to them. So like if you were the person that had the information, feel free to jump up and say something. But other than that, you know, you're in listen mode. So to me, it wasn't so much rules breaking, it was the normal process breaking. So it's not, people felt very comfortable because if you're a junior person in the room, you would contribute, but your boss and your boss's boss and your boss's boss were also on that same thing hearing it. So that one gives you a very strong incentive to get it right. But also if you're wrong or you don't have the authority, that's gonna, people are gonna be like, nope, they were not doing that type thing. So it was very important. I think it could be a good model, but again, one of the things that you're gonna have to do that has already come up in this conversation is you're gonna have to have some framework, some organization that does this pre-crisis. So it understands who does what, has the relationships, knows who to email, pick up the phone, Slack, chat, whatever it is that we're going to do, to make things happen when all of a sudden the volume of work, the things we're sorting through change exponentially. So you're not building that, post-crisis and trying to figure it out when everything else is going on. Which brings me back, Dr. Lattimore, you were talking about the information flow. And I was curious because you were talking about entities could get information if they provided information. And I was wondering, and then your follow-on comments, were you thinking those are government entities? Is this private? Is it both? Like, what would be a way to structure that? Because I think one of the great advantages we have in a democracy and our system of free enterprise is that flexibility to move faster than government, because you don't have necessarily that same clearinghouse process for moving money, which is needed for proper oversight. But then you also have to have an incentive for private industry. Otherwise, it's not going to be there. So I was wondering if you could comment on your thoughts, if it was government, if it was private sector, or both.
Sure, I'm happy to. And I'm also looking at the question here. Is it, let me see what happens when I hit answer live. Seeing this kind of a similar question on how, when I noted surveillance and medical countermeasures are seen as two separate tasks, how do you think having automatic triggers would be useful, where once the surveillance reaches a certain benchmark, certain actions are automatically taken, and how to better integrate the two tasks? So let me try to kind of roll all of that into one for you. I think this is a point where we need to have more discussion, right? Like, this needs to be a partnership, and it does need to include the government. It needs to include private, NGOs. It needs to include industry. It also needs to include our international partners. We require information from other countries, right? We don't have a good means of collecting that. And there are elements of PAPA that are related to this in terms of investing R&D in lab enablement internationally that can help us get those kinds of relationships, is what I would say, right? So you're turning on capability, but you're also, to your point, John, you're building relationships so that you have people there who, the first time you're trying to ask something of another country, it's not in a crisis when you're in need. That's really, really important as we talk about LMICs. And this is a hot topic. It was a hot topic, around Nagoya and WHA 2 weeks ago. So I think it needs some broader conversation, and I don't know exactly what those forums would be. But I could, I guess, offer some. I would say more specifically on how do you integrate these tasks, I would model again after the intelligence community, right? We need to have open source collection that's just happening all the time. You need to have dedicated people who are looking for changes. In our own data at Ginkgo, where we are doing wastewater surveillance, we don't do wastewater surveillance the way some of it's done, where it's kind of at the community level. We do it at unit level. You could think like ship level or nursing home or hospital. So in one of the nursing homes where we do this, we were looking for COVID and wastewater, which is a pretty cheap surveillance mechanism. And we saw a steady state, and then we saw a spike. And when we saw the spike, we're not in the facility. All we're doing is calling the facility and saying, hey, we just saw a spike. And we think, go run with it. They tested and they found 11 residents with COVID, some of whom were asymptomatic. And that was right before the holidays. And they were able to then go in. And then you think about, okay, enter the medical countermeasures, test to treat, right? So whether you're talking flu or COVID or anything else where you've got Tamiflu or Paxlovid that you could then help further mitigate an outbreak, you also have policy mechanisms. In that situation, you can isolate those patients. You can test more people. You can limit visitors. We need to be thinking about that kind of concept and how we want to turn things on and off in a more modular fashion. When we were doing the original data stuff, it was, as I said, it was straight out of the IC playbook. I was integrating layers of data, trying to predict immediately where the disease was going to spread, why it was going to spread there based on dynamics of the city. And we were trying to do a couple things. We were trying to parachute teams in to have backup medical resources. We were also trying to advance PPE and ideally have the data to say, hey, California, we don't think you need this right now. Can you pass this forward? And in turn, we'll take your ventilators, your old ventilators, and we'll give you new ventilators in a couple months, but we push those forward. We were also trying to figure out how to toggle on and off. There was never a need for the whole country to shut down at once. We should have been watching localized data and saying, hey, it's starting to go hot. And then when it starts to go hot, we then put additional restrictions or additional testing. You go from no testing to maybe pre-syndromic surveillance testing, right? So what you saw in schools or like what we do in airports where it's before people are making it to the hospitals. And then you can just, follow that down. As I talked about the monoclonals, there's other examples where we could take that information and pass that through to industry. It is complicated without some sort of, for the government to be engaged without some sort of contract vehicle that allows that engagement and kind of protects the IP and everything else. But I think those are solvable. And we see those because we participate in consortia where we have those relationships and we are absolutely disclosing what our capabilities are. And we're trying to think about how to be the front end and the back end. But the other really complicated part here is that most of the surveillance data from non-military, non-foreign locations is coming into CDC. And it's a very culturally different place. It's a wonderful place. And you will have incredible insights, the best insights you can have, but you're not going to have it this week or this month. You're going to have it in a couple months. And they should be doing that. And they should be analyzing the early predictions that the triangulated information and say, hey, were you right or wrong and why? And how do we fix that mechanism? But at the same time, you need to hand that to someone who is like, oh, okay, well, that's not great. That's not perfect information. But based on that, I think we can, safely, with this level of confidence, take the ventilators from this location. Or we can say, hey, this area is mostly a white collar town that could go to telework, and we're going to push as many people to telework as possible. And then we're going to have them allocate their testing resources or their PPE to factories so that they could stay open because those people have to be in person to do their job. And so that's the kind of like real-time analytics that I think you see in any military operations center anywhere in the world. And we just don't have that in this space with those same comfort levels. And, in the response, it got to the point where some of the scientists wouldn't share information and we had to, do the calculations ourselves and rely on other people that have similar skill sets, but like a different risk aversion. So we relied on financial people and mathematicians, as opposed to some of the PhDs. We have to fix that going forward, right? The CDC is absolutely an essential capability for this country. They are doing some of the best science out there. They have to be able to quickly look at the work and say, you're completely off the mark, but they also can't be the one to stop the information or action from going forward in those moments. And, I think FDA kind of gets that reputation too. And what I would say is there's no one, I don't think, besides the DoD who gets paid to train, right? Yes, you do fight, but you mostly are getting paid to train for the fight. And we aren't incorporating enough of those exercises, but anyone who's been through an exercise knows that's where you learn everything. And if we had, like, hey, here's a pathogen, we're dropping it in, kind of the way DHS is doing it, but with a broader group of completely notional details, so there's no security issues. And say, all right, here you go, team, like new pathogen dropped, surveillance, how are you detecting this? Like, were your surveillance systems set up in the right locations, the fewest number of locations to capture the most relevant data across all of the disease types we might be looking at? And did you appropriately feed that in? Or where did it get hung up? And the same thing on the medical countermeasures end. Okay, new pathogen, it drops. What are the technologies we could use? And I would have your FDA, I would have all kinds of government oversight watching those kind of hackathon style programs so that the FDA is like, what is that platform they're talking about? Should we be looking at this? And can go behind the scenes and start getting comfortable with that technology and thinking about, is this a new platform technology, or what would need to be true for us to be able to throw that out the door next week? And so those are the kinds of things where my headspace goes. I think there's a lot of engineering methodology that could just be applied to that for great gain, with not a lot of cost, not a lot of sustained effort that would plug back into the capabilities that are existing in the preparedness side and fall in on the response side.
Can I pick up on a couple of themes here? Because I'm mindful of the time, and there are, this is all about PAPA reauthorization, and there are a couple of related gaps that I think those that are on the call should be thinking about. Tracie touched on one of them, which is around our real-time surveillance capability for outbreak detection and for management of the response. It's really remarkable that at the beginning of the pandemic, we didn't have a real-time surveillance capability to see when the virus was and where the virus was entering the U.S. There was some discussion about that being stood up in several sentinel cities, but I didn't see that materialize. And we've had the technology to be able to do this kind of thing for a couple of decades. And so when you think about the role of an agency like CDC, this is a very operational, this is an operational capability that we really ought to have. And we have a forecasting center there now, which is great, but I think it should be tested. Meaning we should look to see whether that center will give us this kind of real-time visibility with molecular surveillance when the next event happens, and we should be practicing that every day. I don't know that we have that, but I think that's the kind of thing that could be stipulated in a reauthorization, that we need to develop that capability. Another is operational research in the midst of an outbreak. So, years into the pandemic, we still couldn't answer basic questions about virus transmission, utility of masks, utility of school closures. We really need that information to guide a public health response early in a pandemic. And nobody should have the impression that because we've seen one pandemic that we know how the next virus is going to behave. We need to start over. I shouldn't say we're not starting from scratch. We know a lot about different viruses like flu viruses and other coronaviruses, but we're going to have to generate evidence to give us confidence in whatever measures we're recommending to the public, and that has to be done in real time. I mean, there should be an operational research agenda that within days is kicked off, so that we're gathering critical information to inform policy. And the third area where I do think there may continue to be a gap is BARDA's role in funding countermeasure development for emerging infectious diseases. My understanding is that the BARDA remit is still limited to what are considered more traditional biological threats and declared threats in the case of, say, SARS-CoV-2. But I think there is a clear need for, in my view, for that remit to be expanded, given that we've now been put on notice and something else is going to come up, and there ought to be the flexibility at HHS to be able to invest in countermeasure development. Just to remind folks, I mean, you can have all the emergency countermeasure development programs in the world that you start the day an event begins, but with the exception of warp speed, it's otherwise going to take a very long time for you to have something. And so ideally you're beginning this work before something happens, with prototype pathogens, working across virus families, using a model that the NIH has promoted, as well as CEPI. CEPI has embraced this as a way to be better prepared, so that in the case of CEPI, that within 100 days, you've got vaccines that are ready to go, 100 days of the outbreak beginning. So I think we in order to achieve that, BARDA needs to be given the authorities to be able to work beyond what are the traditional threats.
And if I could just foot stomp that, in absence of the authorities, you're going to be fighting with OMB for some percentage of that 100 days, trying to go back and forth about whether you really have the authorities to spend the money or not.
It's really important, I think, that OMB have a cross-cutting person to evaluate budgets across agencies for this purpose, and they should be senior enough that people can't ignore it. because agencies don't like spending money on other people's, what they consider other people's priorities. Defense is classic for that. I mean, the classic line, and I've been to hundreds of meetings of the Defense Department where they say, well, it looks like you're just trying to steal our money. Making a new vaccine for COVID is not really is really an HHS responsibility. And what they're really saying is, we want to use our budget to buy submarines. We don't want to use it to buy vaccines. And they have a point. The problem is, of course, that the competition in the HHS budget includes lots of things that are also necessary, very necessary. And you're going to have to spend money on preparation for a pandemic that may not happen or may happen next week, but it's a lot easier to underfund that because there's no real impact of not funding training and preparedness. And that's the real quandary here. Every time there's an epidemic, everybody gets all freaked out and they do all kinds of things and like warp speed, and they break all the rules and they change all the whatever, because the actual electorate is paying attention and the senior leadership's paying attention. But in between time, when I first went to the White House in 1998, when the Bush administration came in, they abolished the Office of Health and Security at the White House. Then 9/11 happened. They recreated the office and they added 5 people to the office. That's when Rajeev came in. Then at the end, believe it or not, at the end of the Bush administration, the Obama administration abolished the Office of Health and Security at the White House. And then they recreated it again about the time of the Ebola pandemic. And then the Trump administration came in and they abolished the Office of Health and Security at the White House. And they did the worst possible thing to show disinterest. They distributed the responsibilities of the Office of Health and Security, Health Biosecurity, to 4 different directorates at the NSC. And if you give a responsibility to another directorate, it ends up at the bottom of the list of things that they're interested in. So it just shows what happens. This is bipartisan. There's nothing, there's nothing partisan about this at all. The fact is, the national security crowd continues to not want to deal with these issues in between the time of a pandemic or a bio threat like the anthrax attacks or H5N1 or Ebola or COVID that actually raises it to the front page in the New York Times. So it's something we have to deal with. And what you need to do, in my opinion, as in Congress, is make sure that you authorize and fund the development of processes in the interregnum between the epidemics, because that's how we're going to do better and we're going to save money and people's lives in the long run.
If I could just add to that, and I'll be real quick looking at time, I would also push that all those things need to happen. And on top of that, we need to keep looking at things from a gap-driven approach, right? So in the DoD, we're always doing R&D in a gap-driven approach, because you can't advance it from S&T to advanced development all along the research pipeline without having a SES or a general officer say they're going to buy it and acquire it. HHS doesn't have that same end state where they have someone who's going to buy it within the government. So they have to have different mechanisms to get through the R&D cycle. But what you see is you don't have a gap-driven approach. And where I think that plays out is the communication inefficiencies and the fiscal inefficiencies. So, one of the big things in PAPA is, well, 2, flu and AMR. The same surveillance networks that were set up for COVID work for flu and could work for AMR in different ways. And yet we're not driving those portfolios together to a gap-driven front-end collection common data, common collection, common output, production of intelligence output to then feed into what should be dispersed subject matter expertise across the various pathogens, right? So we're not gaining those efficiencies because we're not looking at it in a gap-driven way. And I think, it's important in particular as we think about the intermediate years. Well, flu's not going away and antimicrobial resistance isn't going away, nor is it going down in the One Health space, and really looking at the ag front for antimicrobial resistance as a source. Those are the areas we should be, in my mind, spending money to build out our processes and our collection and our capabilities to make sure that we're staying warm on this stuff for when a new human pathogen pops up that we have to respond in a similar fashion. And I think what's not talked about quite enough is COVID fundamentally reset our immune systems. It's changing the way our body is functioning, everyone who's had it, and different for different people. But the mountains of data are indicating that we're going to see more new things, but we're also going to see more resurgence of things that were once controlled. And so thinking about, as those are bubbling up, and we want to think about that medical countermeasure pipeline, we want to be thinking about how to capture this data now in a way so that we can really understand when those things are rising and falling so that we can build towards the countermeasures.
Wow, I'm trying to think of how to wrap all that up. But I think some of the themes we keep hitting on this is, one, we need to be able to shrink timelines. And I think you do that through your early warning, through your monitoring. How do I even know I'm having a problem? So the more to the left we can do on that, the better off. But then also when we look at our administrative and response procedures, how can we shrink that? How can we make certain that we're moving faster? So I think those are two key aspects that we hit upon in a bunch of different areas. I also think, and Dr. Rajeev, you had mentioned this, but really on the operational research side, is it having a desired effect? So, okay, we said this. Okay, great. What is that thing? Is it making the difference? Is it doing what we wanted to? Or are we seeing something else? So I think it's very important that is thought about ahead of a crisis, but then going into it and you say, okay, here's what we're doing, is coming up with a way to ensure we're monitoring that and someone is looking at that. And again, I also think it's very important to communicate it, so you have, not only the folks at home and localities, but other local, state elected officials and private industry that can look and tap into that as a resource. And the other one I'd say is kind of that going off of all of the possibilities, not just a known list, but how are we looking at for the unknowns where it's an engineered threat, where as Dr. Lattimore, you were saying, something that was under control once, but now it's not because there's a change in the environment. Was it zoonotic? Was it, whatever that thing is, are we looking at that to make certain that we have thought about it? We have done all these things. And then the one thing I'll say on top of that is I would just add, are we exercising it? Because that's one thing that I've learned is if you don't actually practice and exercise it, but it's just a plan on the shelf, you probably have nothing. So I appreciate all those thoughts coming up today. I hope this was very helpful and informative for those of you who are able to take time and make it today. And our next session will be on Tuesday, June 20th, and it will dovetail nicely into this, as we will be looking at early warning and how that can be affected through the PAPA reauthorization. But I'd like to take this time to thank all three of our panelists, Bernard, Dr. Lattimore, and Dr. Venkayya, for your time today and sharing this based on your experience. Thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you again at one of these venues sponsored by the Council on Strategic Risks. Thank you very much.
Thank you.